The wind came hard across the prairie that morning, dragging dust along the ground like a restless spirit, and Lila Bennett stood beside the broken fence with her hands on her hips, staring at the damage the storm had left behind, the wooden posts leaning like tired soldiers, wire sagging low enough for cattle to wander through if they felt the urge. And she sighed, because this ranch was already more work than she could handle alone. She had only asked for a simple repair, just a cowboy who knew how to swing a hammer and tighten wire, not someone who would complicate her quiet life. Yet out in the distance, she could already see a rider approaching through the haze of dust. The horse moved slow but steady hooves, thudding softly against dry earth, and the man riding it looked like he belonged to the land itself, tall in the saddle, shoulders wide beneath a weathered coat, his hat pulled low against the sun. And when he stopped near the broken fence, he studied it the way a rancher studies the sky before rain, calm and patient. Lila folded her arms and eyed him carefully, because strangers had a way of bringing trouble with them out here, and she had enough of that already. She cleared her throat and said she only needed the fence fixed, nothing more. And the cowboy tipped his hat slightly and said his name was Ethan Cole, and that fixing fences was something he understood just fine. Lila watched him dismount, noticing how quietly he moved, despite the heavy boots and the spurs that glinted in the sunlight. There was a kind of calm about him, the sort of quiet confidence that made people step aside without being told. He crouched near the fallen post and pressed his palm against the wood, checking how deep the break ran. Then he glanced up at the line of fencing stretching across the pasture and gave a slow nod, saying the storm must have been stronger than it looked from town. Lila shrugged and said storms had a habit of doing that out here. Then she reminded him she could pay fair wages for the repair, but she did not need a hired hand staying longer than necessary. Ethan did not seem offended by that. Instead, he gave a faint smile that barely moved his lips and said he was only passing through anyway, just another cowboy chasing work and open road. He gathered his tools from the saddlebag and began pulling the old nails loose with steady hands, and Lila found herself watching longer than she meant to, noticing the way the sunlight caught the dust in the air around him, the way his horse waited patiently nearby as if it understood every movement he made. She shook off the thought quickly and reminded herself that men like him never stayed long in one place, and that was exactly how she liked it. The morning stretched slowly into afternoon, the prairie buzzing softly with insects and distant cattle calls, and Ethan worked along the fence line with quiet determination, lifting new posts into place, tightening wire until it hummed faintly in the wind, and every so often Lila handed him tools or held a board steady while he hammered it down. Their conversations were short and practical at first, mostly about the fence and the ranch, but little by little the silence between them grew less awkward, until he finally asked how long she had been running the place alone, and she answered without looking at him that it had been 3 years since her father passed, 3 years since the responsibility of the land had fallen squarely on her shoulders. Ethan paused when she said that, resting the hammer against the post while he studied the rolling hills around the ranch house. He said the land looked well cared for despite the storm damage, and Lila laughed softly, because that was the nicest compliment anyone had given her in a long while. She told him most folks thought a woman could not keep a ranch running by herself, but the cattle did not seem to mind who fed them as long as the job got done. Ethan nodded slowly and said cattle were simple creatures compared to people, and that remark carried a quiet weight behind it that made Lila glance at him with curiosity. The sun was sliding lower when a distant rumble drifted across the prairie. Not thunder this time, but the sound of hooves pounding far away. Lila stiffened immediately because she recognized the direction it came from, beyond the ridge where a neighboring ranch had been abandoned months ago. Ethan noticed the change in her expression and asked what was wrong. She hesitated before answering, then admitted there had been trouble in the area lately. Small bands of rough riders passing through, men who believed empty land belonged to whoever had the guns to claim it. Ethan followed her gaze toward the ridge, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were measuring something unseen. After a moment the sound faded and the prairie fell quiet again, leaving only the whisper of wind against the new wire fence. Ethan drove the last nail into place and stepped back to admire the line of sturdy posts standing straight against the open land. He wiped dust from his hands and said the fence should hold through the next storm just fine. Lila thanked him and reached for the small pouch of coins she had promised for the work, but when she handed it to him, their fingers brushed for just a second, and something unspoken passed between them, something neither of them expected. Lila quickly pulled her hand away and reminded herself again that she only wanted a cowboy to fix her fence, not someone who might start fixing parts of her life she had spent years learning to live with. The sun dipped low behind the prairie hills that evening, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold, and Lila Bennett stood beside the freshly repaired fence, watching Ethan Cole coil the last length of wire. The land felt calmer now, steadier somehow, yet the distant sound she had heard earlier still echoed faintly in her thoughts. Riders out beyond the ridge rarely meant anything good, especially these days, and though she had lived alone on the ranch long enough to handle most troubles, something about the way Ethan had looked toward that ridge made her uneasy, like he recognized trouble before it even arrived. She told herself it was none of her concern once he rode away, but the thought of the prairie going quiet again after he left felt strangely heavier than she expected. Ethan tied his tools back onto the saddle and gave the repaired fence one last glance. The posts stood straight and strong now, holding the pasture like they were meant to. Lila handed him a small canteen of water, and he drank slowly, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand before thanking her. She asked where he planned to head next, and he shrugged lightly as if direction had never mattered much to him. Cowboys like him followed work and open roads more than maps. But there was a careful pause before he answered, as though some part of him was deciding how much truth to give. He finally said there was a town a few miles west where he might find a bed and a hot meal, though the way he said it made it sound more like a place he hoped to pass through quietly. They walked together toward the ranch house while the last light faded, boots crunching softly in the gravel path, and Lila found herself asking questions she had not planned to ask. Where he came from, how long he had been riding alone. Ethan answered simply, saying he had worked cattle across half the territory, from dusty trail drives to lonely mountain ranches, the sort of life that kept a man moving before roots could take hold. Lila nodded because she understood the value of distance too, yet she noticed he never mentioned family or a place he once called home, and there was a shadow in his voice when he spoke about the past, the kind of shadow that usually followed trouble. They had almost reached the porch when the quiet evening cracked open with the sharp echo of gunfire somewhere far across the prairie. Both of them froze instinctively, Ethan's head turning toward the sound with the quick alertness of someone who had heard too many bullets in his lifetime. Lila felt her stomach tighten as another faint shot rolled across the hills. It was distant, but close enough to carry on the wind. Ethan stepped forward a few paces and studied the darkening ridgeline. Then he spoke quietly, saying those riders she mentioned earlier might not be passing through after all, and something in his tone told her he understood exactly the kind of men who fired guns just to remind the land they were there. Night settled slowly across the ranch, the sky filling with cold bright stars, while a lantern flickered on the porch beside them. Lila insisted Ethan stay for supper before riding out, partly out of courtesy and partly because the prairie felt less lonely with another person nearby. He hesitated only a moment before agreeing, tying his horse beside the barn. Inside the small kitchen the scent of coffee and stew warmed the quiet house, and for a little while their conversation drifted toward simple things, cattle prices, weather patterns, the stubborn habits of ranch animals. But every now and then Ethan's gaze wandered to the window facing the distant ridge. Finally Lila set down her cup and asked the question she had been holding back. She asked if those riders out there were the kind of trouble he already knew. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, the lantern light casting long shadows across his face. For a moment he looked like a man deciding whether the truth would cause more harm than silence. Then he admitted there were men in this territory who liked claiming land that did not belong to them. Rough outfits who rode in groups and pushed smaller ranches until they gave up or left. Lila listened carefully and said she had heard rumors of that already, though no one had come directly onto her property yet. Ethan nodded slowly, but his expression remained serious. He explained that men like that rarely rushed their plans. They watched from a distance first, measuring fences, cattle, and how strong the owner might be. Lila felt a chill run through her despite the warm room, because she realized the riders earlier might have been doing exactly that, watching her land the same way wolves watch a herd, before deciding which animal to chase. She forced a small smile and said if they expected her to hand the ranch over easily, they would be disappointed. Ethan's lips curved faintly at that, because he could already tell she had more stubbornness than most ranchers he had met. Later that night, Ethan stepped outside onto the porch, while Lila cleared the dishes inside. The prairie stretched silent beneath the moonlight, silver grass rolling in the breeze. He rested his hands on the wooden railing and stared toward the dark ridge far away. The truth he had not spoken lingered heavily in his mind, because those riders were not just strangers passing through the territory. He recognized the pattern of their movement, the careless gunshots, the quiet watching from a distance. And if his suspicions were right, the men out there were part of a gang he once rode alongside years ago, a gang that never forgot a man who walked away. Ethan sighed quietly and looked back toward the warm light inside Lila's house, realizing she had only wanted a cowboy to fix her fence. But the trouble riding toward this ranch might force him to stay longer than either of them planned. Morning came slowly across the prairie, pale sunlight stretching over the grass while a thin layer of dust drifted along the road leading to Lila Bennett's ranch. The quiet should have felt peaceful, but Ethan Cole stood beside the barn with a tightness in his chest he had not felt in years, because far out beyond the ridge a line of riders had appeared, dark shapes moving steadily closer across the open land. Lila stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee and followed his gaze, and the moment she saw them, her shoulders stiffened. There were 5 of them riding side by side like men who believed the land belonged to whoever had the boldness to take it. Ethan rested one hand against the saddle horn of his horse and muttered quietly that it seemed her visitors had decided to stop by after all. The riders approached without hurry, hoofs beating a slow rhythm against the hard ground, and when they finally reached the edge of the property, one of them rode ahead of the others, tall and broad-shouldered with a black hat pulled low over sharp eyes. Lila recognized the kind of man he was immediately, the sort who spoke politely while already deciding how much trouble he would cause. He stopped a few yards from the gate and looked around the ranch with a casual smile. Then he greeted them like old neighbors meeting on a dusty road, asking if the land belonged to Lila Bennett. She answered yes with steady confidence, even though her heart was pounding. The rider nodded thoughtfully and said his name was Garrett Shaw, and that he and his men had been looking for new grazing territory. Ethan remained silent beside the barn at first, watching carefully as Garrett spoke, but the moment the rider's eyes shifted toward him, the polite smile vanished from Garrett's face. Recognition flickered there like a spark catching dry grass, and the air between them suddenly felt heavy with old history. Garrett leaned slightly in his saddle and let out a low laugh, saying he never expected to see Ethan Cole working a quiet ranch fence after disappearing from the trail the way he had years ago. The other riders behind him exchanged curious looks, clearly realizing their boss had found someone he knew. Lila glanced between the 2 men with confusion because she could see immediately that this meeting was not a coincidence. Ethan stepped forward slowly until he stood beside Lila near the gate, dust swirling lightly around his boots. He kept his voice calm but firm when he answered Garrett, saying he had no interest in old roads anymore, and that the ranch behind him belonged to someone who had earned it. Garrett listened with a crooked grin. Then he gestured across the wide pasture where the cattle grazed peacefully under the morning sun. He said it was a fine piece of land for a woman to be managing alone, and that his men could make good use of it. The meaning behind his words hung in the air like a challenge. Lila felt anger rising in her chest, but Ethan lifted a hand slightly, silently asking her to let him speak first. Garrett swung down from his horse and walked a few steps toward the gate, boots crunching against gravel while his men watched from their saddles. He reminded Ethan that once upon a time they had ridden together across territories far rougher than this quiet valley. He said men like them were not meant to settle down mending fences for strangers. The world belonged to riders who took what they needed before someone else did. Ethan listened without interrupting, but the memory of those years stirred something dark in his mind. He remembered the dust, the raids, the long nights of realizing the life he was living would eventually cost someone innocent their home. That was the reason he had walked away from Garrett's gang in the first place. Lila finally stepped forward beside Ethan, her voice steady despite the tension twisting through the air. She told Garrett this ranch was not for sale, and that her fences were strong enough to keep cattle where they belonged. Garrett's smile returned slowly, but it held no warmth now. He glanced toward the repaired fence line stretching across the pasture and said it looked newly fixed. Then he nodded toward Ethan and remarked that she had hired herself a capable cowboy. For a moment the silence between them felt sharp as a drawn blade, until Ethan answered calmly that the job was finished and the fence would hold just fine. Garrett studied him for a long moment before finally chuckling and stepping back toward his horse. He said he would not start a fight today because the territory had plenty of land to look at before making decisions. but his eyes drifted once more across Lila's ranch, as if measuring it carefully. He warned that fences sometimes failed when storms rolled through, and when they did, cattle had a habit of wandering. Ethan understood the threat hidden in those words. Garrett mounted his horse again and signaled his riders to turn back toward the ridge, dust rising behind them as they disappeared slowly across the prairie, the same way they had arrived. The ranch fell quiet once more after the riders vanished beyond the hills. Lila let out a long breath she had been holding since morning and turned toward Ethan with a mixture of relief and frustration in her eyes. She told him she had only wanted someone to repair a fence, not bring trouble to her doorstep. Ethan lowered his gaze for a moment, because he knew she was right, yet he also knew the truth now. Garrett Shaw would return eventually, and when he did, the ranch would need someone who understood men like that. He finally looked back at her and said softly that he could ride out today if she wanted, leave the trouble behind with him. But Lila glanced toward the strong new fence stretching across the pasture, and then back at the quiet cowboy standing beside her. And after a long, thoughtful pause, she said the fence might be fixed already, but the ranch could probably use a cowboy around a little longer.